In Feudal Patrol, at the beginning of each turn, you roll a six-sided die for each element under your control. So in general, in Feudal Patrol, players control some number of elements. An element is usually 4 to 6 figures. So in this case, you see I have 3. And I have the 3 elements are grouped into what's known as a warband with a warband leader. And then, of course, warbands are grouped into larger organizations on up. So I roll these six-sided dice at the beginning of each turn, which means they may be different from turn to turn. And then once everybody's done that, I start flipping cards from what's known as the activation deck, and that determines the order that these numbers move. Now, one of the things that's important is that everybody, when the number comes up, so in this case a 1, everybody on the table who has a 1 for their activation die or their command die gets to activate simultaneously. So you don't have one person doing stuff and a whole bunch of people sitting around the table watching them. Everybody who's got a 1 would get to go. Now in this case I don't have a 1, and so other people would be moving or doing something with their warbands and their elements. Now if it turns out that 2 people are facing each other, you'll randomize, who have the same number, you'll randomize to see who goes first. But in general, everybody moves simultaneously. So I flip a 1. Maybe there's other people with a 1, but I don't have 1. So when everybody who's got a 1 is done, we flip the next card. That's a 4. Now I have 2 4s. My warband leader and this element have a 4. Now one of the things that a warband leader can do is he can swap his die with one of his subordinate elements as long as that element's number or his number have not come up previously in the turn. So the 2 hasn't come up yet in this turn, so what I can do is with this warband leader, he's going to swap dice, and so now this one and this one would get to activate. When they're done activating, and all the other 4s are done activating around the table, I flip the next card. Oh, 5. So now this unit would activate, and then finally I flip the last card, and it's a 2, and so the warband leader who swapped out his die would get to go. Let's talk briefly about how movement works. So we talked earlier about activation, so I flip this card, I get a 4. This element and this element are now going to activate, so let me move with this element first. Right there, if we look at our card, their level of encumbrance is a medium, which means they're carrying a shield and some other equipment. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to flip a card, and I'm going to look at this card, and the card says, is it in focus? I don't know. So the card, this blue arrow gives me my, I'm looking for my level of encumbrance, which is a medium. So I look next to the M and it says I get to move 7 inches. So this unit would now move up to 7 inches. I measure each figure. Right, so each figure would get to go 7 inches. There are terrain effects associated with moving through woods and over obstacles and those kinds of things. I completely finish that unit's activation before I go on to the next unit. So I flip the next card, and next to level of encumbrance of medium, it tells me that I get to move 8 inches. So now I would measure for this unit, I would go 8 inches, and these guys would come over here. Okay. Generally, carrying the big shield moves your level of encumbrance up from light to medium. Okay, then I flip the next card. The next card is a 5, so that would be this unit. So let me get these cards out of the way. I flip the next card, and it says 7. So this unit would get to move 7 inches, right? And that's basically how movement works. Okay, and finally I get to the 2, and that leader. His level of encumbrance is also medium. He's moving a little more slowly. He got a 5 result. And that's movement. So now I'm going to give you a short example of how missile fire and melee work in Feudal Patrol. What we're going to do is, I'm not going to worry about activation sequence and all of that. I've described that earlier. But I've got this unit of shield maidens with slings is going to shoot their slings at these Vikings here, and then they're going to activate and charge is the basics situation here. So the first thing to note when you're doing missile fire is that if you have a ranged weapon, it has 3 range bands: short, medium, and long range, and a rate of fire. So in this case, the slings have a a rate of fire of 1, and they have ranges of 3, 6, and 12. So 3 inches is short range, 6 inches is long, medium range, and then 6 to 12 inches is long range. So the slings are within medium range. So for each shooter, I'm going to flip a card from the action deck to determine if I get a hit or not. Now, an important nuance to this is that if the leaders are shooting, right, they're not directing the fire of their troops, and so all their troops are going to apply a negative modifier. So typically what's going to happen is your leaders are not going to shoot, because then everybody who subsequently shoots gets that minus. So I'll use this card we've already used to sort of walk through the modifiers. So if you look at the card, there's these shields across the top. If it's gray, that indicates a miss, and if it's colored in, that indicates a hit. And you use that for either missile fire or melee. Now, there's two different sets of modifiers here. So I would start by saying, okay, my accuracy number for shooting is a 6, right? So I start over in the 6 shield, that's gray. But I would also then apply a modifier to that. So this says if the target is moving, which would occur for reaction fire, if the leader is not present, meaning incapacitated, or he's shooting instead of directing fire, if the shooter is wounded, or if the target is at medium range, I apply 1 shift. And those are cumulative. So if I have a wounded person firing at medium range, then I would shift over twice. I would shift twice if the target is at long range or the shooter is moving. Now typically shooters won't be moving, but there's a rule that says if I have to turn because the target is outside my 180 degrees, I would apply that shooter moving modifier. All right, so let's see how this goes. So I'm going to flip the first card. I'm going to go from the shooter's left to right. So this slinger here, she's going to throw her sling, and it says it's all grade shields across the top, but in addition there's these red words that say, in this case, firearm explodes. Now she doesn't have a firearm. If she had a firearm, it would explode, it would be out of the game, but since she doesn't have a firearm, it's just a miss, so she's done. I move on to the next shooter, and I get all colored in shields, so no matter what kind of a modifier I would apply, and there actually aren't any that apply in this case, but no matter what kind of modifier, that would be a hit. So I get a hit, so I'm going to flip the next card, not that card, but I'm going to flip the next card to determine who I hit and how severely I hit that person. So the other thing you need to note is on the weapons, there's these 4 shapes, and one of them will be colored in for the weapon. In this case, the sling is a square. That indicates the level of damage that weapon produces, right? So the more sides in that polygon, the more damage generally that it will produce. So I flip this card, and it says figure number 2 is hit in the lower abdomen and is for 3 points of damage. But if the figure has a medium shield, the shield will protect him from some of that damage. So figure number 2, I always start from the shooter's left, 1, 2. This figure's been hit for 3 points of damage. Now my endurance is 3. 3 points of damage will incapacitate him. However, it hit his shield, so what's going to happen instead is, instead of taking 3 points of damage and being incapacitated, he's going to take 2 points of damage, and he's going to be stunned. Now, anytime your people take damage or should have taken damage, that's a nuance that you'll have to wait and read in the rulebook. If you took damage or should have taken damage, the leader accrues a morale result, which you'll have to work off later when the unit activates. All right, I have one more shooter, this little girl here with a rock, and she gets all hits as well. So I flip the next card, and the next card says person number 5 is hit in the leg for 1 point of damage, no shield cover this time. So who's figure number 5? I count from where I left off, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's the same figure again, wounded in the leg, no armor, he's incapacitated, and the unit receives a second morale check. So the shooting is over. Now, the next unit to activate, we're going to say for purposes of the example, is these guys. The 4 card comes up, and they're going to activate now. So the first thing that has to happen is this unit has to make 2 morale checks, 1 for each morale marker that it's accrued. So I flip the first card, and this says, this place ain't healthy, sir. Figure with the lowest guts in the open runs 10 inches toward cover or away from the enemy and becomes stunned. Now, they all have the same guts. They're all guts regular. So I flip the card, and it says person number 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. This person is going, this figure is going to run 10 inches away. Good for these guys. It's the leader. not a good deal. And I worked off one morale marker. So now I'm going to flip the next one, and it says my wee sister can do better than that. The unit is unaffected. That's essentially a pass. All right, now these guys can go. They have 3 figures left. The leader's way back here, and there's the leader for this unit. So they're going to flip a card with their level of encumbrance as a medium, so they get to move 8 inches. Plenty of movement for them to get into contact with these slinger girls here. Now the slingers also have a sword. So who's going to get to fire first in this case? So the 2-handed axes that these guys are carrying and the spears. So we have 2 of them with spears and 1 with a sword. So the spears get to go first. Their reach is a 5. The sword is a 3. So 5 is greater than 3. So the spearman goes first. So we're going to do this matchup first. I flip a card, and his melee number is a 6. So the spearman. So I'm looking over the 6, and the shield is gray. So that indicates a miss. And there aren't any, nobody's stunned, nobody's wounded. I'm not using a polearm in a constricted space. I'm not cavalry charging with impetus, and I'm not infantry in close combat. So there's no modifiers. Your gray 6. This figure missed. Now he went first. If he had done damage, this figure would be responding in a damaged state, but he didn't. So that girl is going to melee him with her sword. All of the shields are filled in. I guess she's desperate. And now let's see. I flip the next card, and it says person number 3. I ignore that. I know I'm fighting this person, but now I'm going to say I did 2 points of damage. That's the red square. And the shield provides protection. So he's got a shield, so instead of taking 2 points of damage, he takes 1 point of damage, and he's stunned, and he must back up 2 inches, and she is allowed to occupy his space. And the leader, who's way back there now, he gets another morale marker. All right, so we flip the next card. So it's this spearman is meleeing this slinger, so again, the spearman's going to go first. I flip a card. I get almost all misses, so that's a miss. The girl's going to fight back. Her melee number is a 7, so I'm looking for a colored in shield over the 7. She gets a miss. Now they both missed. You're not allowed to remain in contact, so they're both going to drop back 1 inch. Okay, last melee. This person with a sword versus this girl here. Their secondary weapons are swords. This will be a simultaneous attack. So I'll do the Viking first, though. His accuracy again is, or melee number again is a 6. There's no colored in shield over the 6 and no modifiers that'll help him, so he misses. The girl, her melee number is a 7. Again, she's a miss as well, so they're both going to back up 1 inch, and that ends the melee. Now it's important to note that you're not allowed to remain in contact. So if neither person does damage, you back up. If only one person did damage, then the damaged person's going to back up 2 inches. And if they're both damaged, they're both going to back up 2 inches. Okay? So that's how melee works.